Hey everybody, welcome back to Live. I'm your host Nick Taylor, and today I'm hanging out with Mike Chen. Mike, how you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Nick.
Yeah, no, we caught up a little bit just before the break. We've been DMing each other on socials a bit, just chatting a bit, and we had a good coffee chat. I guess part of that conversation just kind of it made kind of sense to talk about what we're going to talk about today. So I guess we'll start off for people that might not know who you are, Mike. Could you maybe just give a bit of a background?
Sure. Yeah, so I am Mike. I am a self-taught developer. So I learned how to code back in 2010 when dinosaurs roamed the earth. I Yeah, like I find it really interesting, like seeing how people are learning now. I always say I think it's like much easier to learn how to code today than it ever has been, but
Yeah,
it's much harder to find a job. Like I think back
yeah,
then it was the opposite. It was really hard to learn, and much easier to find a job. There's like much less
yeah.
saturation in the field.
Yeah,
Um,
no, it's
but
totally.
yeah. I learned from, like, books. I read a bunch of books on, like, how to write code, and, like, I read code samples and books and stuff. Like, there was no code academy, there was no free code camp, there's no Odin project, there were no, like, YouTube channels with, like, Indian dudes teaching how to code. Um, so, yeah, that was back in the day. I kinda pivoted from a pre-med background. I was gonna go to med school, but then decided to do this coding thing.
Okay.
Landed in Oh, sorry, go ahead. I was
No,
gonna
no, I
give
was
my whole
just saying.
spiel, but
No, I was just saying. Okay, yeah, no, go for it.
yeah, so I landed in some startups, and then I worked my way up to bigger startups, and then I landed out in Silicon Valley at Yahoo. Worked at a couple bigger companies like Google, Airbnb,
Okay.
and then came down for a landing back in startup land. I always knew I'd be back in startup land someday, but here I am. So yeah, I made the pivot to engineering management around 2019, and right now I'm the CTO and co-founder of a small behavioral health startup called Motivo. My time with Motivo is coming to an end, but
Okay.
uh, but yeah, I think it was good. It's some really good lessons from being there, from being a CTO, from transitioning to engineering management and all that.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. Yeah, I think we're kind of like in. I think I'm a little older than you, but I come from that same kind of era where like Google did not exist when I was starting on the internet. I was into books too. I mean, I still read books now, but uh, it's just wild to think that stuff like Stack Overflow didn't exist, and like obviously things. The whole game has changed now with AI, obviously,
Mhm.
but it's wild times. And also just gonna say hey to a few people in the chat. Hey Arvin, how you doing? Good to see you. Hey Richard, good to see you too, and Ryan. Thanks for hopping in here. Um, this is more curiosity on my part, but when you worked at Yahoo, did you work on UE at all, like the framework, or were you more on back end stuff, or
I had begun my also hey, Ryan and Richard, good to see you guys as well. Um, I yeah, like we were using Yui at the time. It was like, yeah,
okay?
it's so weird like hearing that name again. No one's talking about Yui in 2024. Um,
Definitely.
but yeah, I worked on Yahoo Mail on the front end. I worked on
Oh,
the
cool.
ads team. So
Oh, that's
um,
awesome.
yeah, it's pretty wild times. I wasn't at Yahoo very long, but like my manager had like something like 51 direct reports. So it was like
Oh,
the
wow.
whole department basically rolling up to like a single manager. So it was really interesting experience, kind of being there. This is like during the Marissa Mayer days as well. So she's really
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
turn the company around at the time.
That's true. I completely forgot about Marissa Mayer.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
know. And
that was a
she's
whole
doing
thing.
like a yeah, she's like still out there building stuff. So good for
Yeah.
her.
No, that's wild to think. And so I mean, Yahoo. I mean, I you know, people that are a little older are probably familiar with Yahoo, and it was like in the heyday, it was one of the big companies. But you've worked at some other notable companies too. Like, if correct me if I'm wrong, but you were at Airbnb. Was that in the early days, or like because like they've been around? It's been a minute now.
It was the later days, like
Okay,
IPO days. Yeah. So they went IPO the year that I left.
okay.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, Airbnb's pretty big now, but it was still startup at the time. And I guess
Yep.
I don't know if like we're definitely going to talk about transitioning to like an engineering manager and then eventually a CTO. But I'm curious what the those IPO days were like. Like, did you join as they just IPO'd, or was it pre-IPO and then IPO'd, or
It
and
was pre-IPO, and then they IPO'd like
okay,
7, 8 months after I left.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
and
So
that's
it was already pretty big by the time I got there. It was like there are like 7,000, and they're a startup in scare quotes, right? Like it's like,
yeah,
what
yeah,
are you really a startup at that point? It's a big company with a global presence at that point.
yeah, and
But it like honestly, it still felt like a startup in some bad ways, right? Like I think their I remember their engineering infrastructure was in like tatters when I got there.
okay.
Um, it was they had just scaled really big. Like I think they like were in the middle of like the microservices transition, like
Okay, yeah.
moving their services out of their mono repo into, or well, it was still a mono repo, but moving it out of the monolith into microservices.
Okay,
And
okay.
um, they were it was a very hard transition for them, right? And I think like it's a pretty hard transition for everyone who's doing that. By the
Yeah.
time I left, it was pretty good. Like I
Okay.
think they fix a lot of the problems. There's some really smart people there that were working on like both front end and back end solutions.
Yeah.
But when I got there, it's like basically like in order to develop locally, you had to basically spin up like every single service locally,
Okay, yeah,
right?
yeah.
So like, hundreds, maybe even thousands of services, and then they moved to this interesting architecture, which I'm not sure how common this is, but they moved to this like shared dev environment where the services you
Okay.
don't need are in a cloud under privately for the developers, and the
Yeah.
ones that you are developing on, you're just working on locally. So I thought that was a pretty cool model. I don't know how common it is for microservice, uh,
Yeah.
you know, for development
I
for
I
microservices.
I know it's definitely a struggle with that kinda, when you have microservices. Like, I know some people in Montreal, they're working at a telehealth company, and I think they did something similar to that, or
Mhm.
because, like, it's kind of like, even if you could, like, you're probably starving your computer of resources just loading up all these
Mhm.
services, like, even from that, standpoint, you know what I mean? It doesn't really seem that feasible.
Yeah.
Also, just a couple other people joining. Hey, thanks for joining, Eduardo and Alex. Good to see you. Um,
Hey, Eddie.
yeah, yeah, it's pretty wild. It's like, because like obviously, like I've always been told, like your local development has to be as close to production as possible because that's how you avoid obviously discrepancies. Like, typically it should just be config like where it's deployed versus your local, but like when things get massive, like and I know you worked at Google too, and they have what I would consider a very strange setup, but it works for them. It's like one massive mono repo. It's
Yes.
like, and it's I don't know. I'm just curious, like, what was it like working in something like that? Because like I think I've heard like conversations from either like Adia's Manny or somebody else who I don't really know, but like they were just mentioning about like I broke something in the mono repo and then like somebody was out of commission for like hours, like it blocked like tons of teams,
Mm.
Not that it's a finger pointing kind of thing, but it's just like it must be interesting working in that kind of setup, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of stuff was happening like all the time, right? Like I think,
Yeah.
um, yeah, to your point about how the Google setup, it's like literally every team commits to a single repo, like at
Yeah.
Google, which is like I think billions of lines of code. I'm not sure. Like it's like at least
Yeah,
like
yeah.
in the tens or hundreds of millions, right, of lines of code. Um, and It was, like, honestly one of the most frustrating, like, I think, maybe this, like, committing a bug that breaks people's workflow isn't,
Yeah.
like, as common, but something that happened a lot was, like, teams were always, like, in the middle of a migration, right? Like,
Oh,
they're
okay,
always,
okay.
like, moving to, like, V4 of their service, and they're like, "Okay, I need to do this thing using V3 of your service." And you go talk to the team, they're like, "No, don't use V3." And then I'm like, "Okay, so should I use V4?" They're like, "No, V4 is not ready yet." And I'm like, "So I don't actually know what to do." That was like a very
Yeah.
common thing and like a joke internally and stuff like that. So um, that's like one of the challenges with working there, like versus like using an open source ecosystem where they kind of have to be better about not breaking stuff, like not kind of like being half done with migration and stuff like that,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah, like it is like I found Google to be kind of a tough environment because of the fact that like they built everything in house, right?
Yeah.
And it means that they're like a lot of times their documentation is just like in the code, right? They don't have like
Oh,
an
okay,
they don't
okay.
have a nice docs page for their tool that everyone's using internally.
Okay.
A lot of times it's just like a Google Doc, or if you're even unluckier, it's just a literally comments in the code. You're just like supposed to go in
Okay.
there and like read the comments. And I think it's like good practice. And it makes me realize how spoiled I am when I use open source tooling with like a
Yeah.
team of like technical writers who are like dedicated to maintaining docs. But at the same time, it was like I was already used to that, and then I went to Google, and like I think it was like frustrating. They do a
Yeah.
really good job of like documenting internally in their code and stuff like that, but
Okay.
that's not the way I like to read. Like that's not the way I like to read documentation for
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is interesting because you always hear people are like, projects live and die by their docs potentially. Like you can still have a successful project without great docs, like, but at least in open source land, most of the projects that have become successful typically have really good documentation as well.
Yeah.
Even if it didn't start off like that, like just over time. So it's like I don't know. It's just kind of interesting because, like, obviously, you get into the code and you'll see it, and then it's like, it's obviously not comments like this is a for loop that does blah blah blah. It's really the comments were like, this is why I did this, or like this is the out. We went with this algorithm because X Y Z. Yeah. Oh,
That's the ideal, but like I think with JS docs you do tend to end up with some comments being like get foo, the function's
yeah,
name get foo, and the comments like gets the foo. So
yeah.
it happens.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely guilty. This is something I was more guilty of when I was younger in my career because it's like, I don't know about you, but I didn't really have mentors when I was
Mhm.
kind of starting. Like I think mentorship is great. I love doing it, like pairing and stuff. But this, at least for me, this was not a common thing. Like this is, to me, it seems like a more recent thing. Like that's been more. Uh, talked about, like I'd say like in the last 10 years, maybe even less than that. Like people
Mhm.
might have had some, but like now it's always like people are like, I need a mentor. Can you mentor me? Like I used to have people just say like, just fucking do it. Like you know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty thick skinned, like just having been around that kind of environment. So like I'm not phased by it if somebody says that to me, but I feel like it could potentially crush a lot of people if you
Mhm.
know what I mean?
Yeah,
Um,
I do.
but yeah.
Um,
Uh,
yeah, like my first boss was like that, where but like in a good way. Like I could tell he cared about me, right? Like I think
yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's like that's really important, right? Like establishing that level of trust and like knowing that this person cares about you. And but like he was like also brutal, like in terms of
Yeah,
like
yeah.
code reviews and stuff like that. And he would like always challenge my thinking, and like he would nitpick the crap out of me, and that's what I wanted, right, at the time. Like I think
Yeah.
it was like really important. But then yeah, like when I got to Google, uh I had always imagined that, oh, I go to Google and I'm surrounded by like these brilliant minds and they're going to teach me stuff. But
Yeah.
they no, like they don't have time. They're doing brilliant mind things.
Yeah.
and they don't have time to like hold my hand and walk me through this thing they wrote, right? It's like
Yeah.
um that's it's like typically that's not like I just don't think that that's what like big tech is like good at, is
Mhm.
teaching you like that one-on-one sense of like mentorship. It's like good at like
Yeah.
surrounding you with people who have solved like really difficult things, but not necessarily good at like helping you walk through it. I do
Yeah.
think that like I do think that like it's hard to learn code today, right? Like I think
Mhm.
I said it was easier, but there's more resources, but there's so much more to learn, right? Than there
Oh, yeah.
was when we were doing it. Yeah, like when we started, it's like there was no React, there was no Angular, right? Like I think like it was just jQuery, right? It was like you had
Yeah.
to learn the DOM and that was it. And it was like CSS and HTML. That's it. Like maybe you
Yeah.
learn PHP, so I do think that like I understand why people want a mentor to
Mhm.
kind of like guide them through this minefield of all this stuff to learn,
Mhm.
and to know what's important and what's not. I think that's like really valuable. But yeah, at the end of the day, like I think your mentor, like even if you do find a mentor, they're gonna want to see you that you know how to help yourself too.
Yeah, exactly, and, and the other thing, I I don't know if, there's obviously the pandemic ZERP era
Yeah.
where, people were landing jobs and stuff, and, you know, boot camps were kinda hit and miss, because some overpromised on things and stuff, but one thing I keep telling people, because people don't necessarily like to hear this, but just because you did a boot camp or even if you went to university, it doesn't mean you get a job automatically. And I, f- I feel like we've kind of failed people in that respect a
Hmm.
bit, because at the end of the day, like even if say you were mentoring me on something I was unaware of, or something new, and we were just pairing and stuff. Like it's great you're mentoring me, but at the end of the day, I still have to put in the work. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's like, because otherwise you don't progress, and then you're just you're just not gonna you're just not gonna get better basically
Yeah.
without putting in the time and I'm all for work life balance. I would be hypocritical if I said I've always been work life balance because early on my career and even sometimes still it's unbalanced. When I was younger, I put in way too much time into things sometimes where I probably should have stepped away. And but also you kind of have to grind a bit to get good at stuff. And
Yeah.
I find people in terms of the work life balance thing, people get mad about this when you talk about that.
Hmm.
And don't get me wrong, there's obviously grifters and bad influencers and stuff, but but if we forget that, it's somebody will spend 20 hours a week playing a video game to get better at it, or they'll practice guitar or whatever. It's no different. It's just that it gets put in the context of it's for your work. All of a sudden, it becomes imbalance, and I don't know. I mean, you just don't get better if you don't, put in the work. It's there's no magic recipe,
Yeah. I think we were talking about this before the break too, of like
Yeah, yeah.
there's a lot of people like giving advice today, right?
Hmm.
And I realize that like I'm one of those people. And um like I think it's just I think the context of advice is really important. Like I think a lot of people will give advice about how to get a job today, and like I can try to give you advice on how to get a job. I This is something I always tell like people mentoring is like my worldview is so narrow compared to like what is actually out there, right? Like I've worked at a couple startups, I've worked at big tech. Like I think that gives me some qualifications to talk about things. So I know how to
Hmm.
land a start job at a startup. I know how to land a job at big tech. I know how to break into tech in 2010, which is
Yeah.
not a valuable skill. That's not a thing that I can mentor people on. Like I don't know how to like I've never broken into tech in
Yeah.
2025, right? And and so people need to take my advice with a grain of salt, right? And like I always
Yeah.
tell them that. Like you have to take everyone's advice with a grain of salt. And so when people are telling you to have like work life balance, yes, don't like burn out, don't kill yourself. Obviously, like the
Hmm.
goal of this is to build a better life in the end, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
that's the goal of everything that we're doing. And if you like, and at the same time, if you like completely burn yourself out and like you land a job in tech and like you don't recognize yourself in 5 years, that's
Yeah.
probably not a win, right? But like at the same time, um, the kind of people like advocating for work life balance are people that have made it already, right? They've like already, they're like
Yeah, yeah.
senior engineers and they can have work life balance because they've already put in the time to like grind it out. And like people are like, they're, just frankly, their skills are in demand, right?
Yeah.
And it's the skills of a fresh boot camper are just not as in demand. It's just like a fact. Like there's no like, I'm not trying to neg on people who had just graduated boot camp. Like it
Yeah.
like the people are going to try to hire you for your potential, but your skills
Mhm.
today are just not as in demand, right? And like you need to put in the work to get those skills,
Yeah.
and then the other piece is about like kind of like people have like there's this big discussion I remember on Twitter about whether or not you need to be passionate about software engineering.
Yeah.
And I think and like the people saying no again are senior people who are like who don't need who can be like burnt out and who can be like tired and like not have to work that much anymore. But
Yeah.
if you are starting out, you're competing with a lot of people, and many
Yeah.
of them are gonna love what they do, and they're
Yeah.
gonna outwork you, right? And so I think at the beginning, if like, yeah, maybe if you're like super talented, maybe you don't need to be passionate, but it really helps. It really helps.
No, yeah, totally. I get that. And one thing and I'm definitely not alone in this, is like, I think when people say they don't like, like I hate this, it's usually because they don't understand it normally.
Mhm.
Like I've heard so many, like if we're talking about CSS for a second, like so many people are
Yeah,
like, "Oh, CSS, it sucks," or "HTML sucks." And it's like even if you're not a front end developer, you should recognize that you can create really powerful things. Yes, you're not doing back end stuff, whatever, but like when people say they hate it or something, it means they don't necessarily understand it. And when you don't understand stuff, you don't necessarily enjoy it as much and you don't want to put the time into it. And when you do, like, at least for me, like when I actually enjoy doing something, I'll just keep cranking away at it, and yeah, it's a tough call about are you passionate or whatever about, what you do. But I think I don't know. I've just been always lucky to like what I do, and
yeah,
that motivates me. Like if I was in a job that I absolutely just did not like, I would either probably get fired because I'm just like, I can't do this, or I would probably quit. Obviously there's a bit of privilege there too, just to throw that out there. But yeah, it's tough,
yeah,
and there's, like you said, a ton of people right now.
yeah. To your point about CSS, yeah, like whenever I see those like memes about CSS, like there's like the Peter Griffin meme where he's like adjusting the blinds. I don't know if you've seen that,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but like people complain about it, like and it like a lot of it is like full stack engineers and like back end engineers like complaining about it, and like I can't tell if people think that like it's doing something random. It's
Yeah,
not. It's like following the rules that the browser developers have programmed into it of how
yeah,
to interpret the CSS thing, right? And if you learn the rules, it will seem less random, right? Like you have to learn the
yeah,
rules, otherwise it's going to look random, right?
yeah,
So yeah,
totally.
I totally agree. Like I think because it's such a different paradigm than
Hmm.
like JavaScript, right? Where you're like, I tell it exactly what to do, and it'll like it should console.log this thing.
Yeah,
CSS is like a little bit more like, oh, I'm just telling the browser how I want this to look, but it's still going
yeah,
to follow the rules that it has, right?
yeah,
Um, so yeah, like I think a lot of it has to do, like a lot of the frustration has to do with just like a lack of depth of knowledge.
yeah,
Um, but like, which is totally understandable at the early stages. I don't want
yeah.
to make people feel bad for not understanding the rules of CSS when they like haven't
Oh
been doing it
yeah.
that long. Yeah.
Well, this kind of ties into like when you go to a boot camp, or honestly, even when I went to university, which has been ages, like there was no like web development courses at the time, but like I was doing traditional stuff like database normalization, data structures. Started off with some C++, did some Java. They pivoted, I think, because Sun Microsystems became a big thing at that point. But like the point is like we didn't even focus on testing in university. Like
Mhm.
there was just a
Yeah.
lot of real world stuff that you're just not going to get from a boot camp or even university. Like I'm saying that from my university experience, like maybe that has changed a bit, but I've spoken to some people and they still say like they don't really talk about testing so much and stuff, this just gets to the point where like this is where you have to put in the time. You're like you're gonna learn about testing on the job, or you'll put some time in yourself, and it's like I don't know. It's just like we were kind of saying like like you could get by with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript if you were getting a front end dev job years ago.
Mhm.
Nowadays, you know, I think it's good that you need to know those fundamentals, but at the end of the day, you're gonna be using those things within the context of a
Yeah.
framework most likely. So not only are you having to learn React, you're also gonna have to understand like, okay, React's this abstraction on top of like all this imperative, HTML, CSS, and
Yeah.
JavaScript happening. And like there's a lot of moving parts there. And then there's like the whole build system. Like there's a million things. And it like so like I don't know. I even when people say just learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, even that I'm kind of like, yeah, not
Yeah.
really. you know,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah. I think about, like, my own company, right? Like, and, on the back end, it's just TypeScript and JavaScript,
yeah,
but it's also Express,
yeah,
and then layered on top of that, we have GraphQL. We also use an ORM, right,
mhm,
for our database.
yeah,
Um, on the front end, it's like the query language that we use for our GraphQL client. It's React. It's like, our state management system. It's like layers and layers and layers, right?
yeah,
And yeah, like if you know just the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, that's
yeah,
not that useful to me, right? Like that's not that
yeah,
useful.
yeah,
Uh, like you're gonna need to learn a lot on the job. Like, and yeah, like I think we've taken on juniors and we've taught them,
yeah,
but man, it was a lot of work. It was a lot of
yeah,
work to teach them. Um, and yeah, you are just not going to be productive on day one at most companies.
yeah,
It's
for
going to
sure.
take months and months. People are taking a chance on you. And yeah, you
Yeah,
have to show that you're capable of like learning on your own. Otherwise,
yeah,
um, otherwise you're going to have at best a surface level understanding of
mhm,
everything. And um, yeah, like I need to believe that you're going to go beyond the surface level, right? I need to believe
yeah.
that in order to hire you.
Yeah, and it's like and obviously the stakes are even higher now. Like, I mean, you have AI tooling. Like
Mhm.
I literally use Claude every day. I've
Yeah.
been flipping between Cursor and VS Code. Um, there's like there's V0 from Vercel, but there's also Bolt.new from the people at
Mhm.
StackBlitz, and I've been cranking out some UIs there because like but I know what to ask for, and this has been discussed before by other people, but like AI in the hands of juniors versus somebody senior
Yeah.
is a very different story,
Yep.
you know? Cuz like I don't know, I treat it like a rubber duck, and also like okay, that's decent, but also add this, don't do that.
Yep.
And a junior or somebody starting off might take it as like face value, and that's where I don't know. I was talking to somebody yesterday about this, but like just education in general, like I don't know where it's going with AI because like you need to learn those tools because they will realistically be in whatever job you do at some point. But also you still have to do the learning path without cutting corners with AI, you know what I mean? And I I don't know how that actually looks, whether that's in
Yeah.
elementary, high school or wherever. It's a tough time, I think, honestly.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm gonna teach my kids about how to use.
Yeah.
Like, I think like the most. It's like incredible as a learning tool. It's really bad as like a production tool. Like if you're trying
Yeah.
to produce things that you're gonna use, right? Like I think it's like,
Mhm.
of course, it's useful like for someone who's learned something before. I've been
Yeah.
meaning to write an article about this of like my experience using Cursor.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like there's still a lot of people who haven't tried Cursor before.
Yeah.
It is like mind blowing, like
Yeah.
how good
It's
it
really
is
good.
at at some things, right? Like I've like created some features within like a full stack, like it's done like the whole stack of making a database migration and creating an endpoint and like with like a one shot prompt, like creating an endpoint, creating the front end for it. It's like done that with like one prompt. Um, at the same time, and like the autocomplete is like incredible.
Yeah.
And at the same time, um, I started I used it in this project and I used Drizzle ORM. It's
Okay.
like a
Yeah. Yeah.
new, it's like a like I've never used it before. And I realized at the end of my project, I built a whole project using it. And like every time I like
Yeah.
needed to write Drizzle code, I prompted it to help me write the Drizzle code. And at the end of
Yeah.
it, I realized that like if I wanted to write a Drizzle query, I couldn't. like
Yeah.
I like from memory, I would need the AI to do it. Like, and that's
Yeah.
me as a senior engineer. I've worked with like maybe like five different ORMs before. I know the mental model of what an ORM is supposed to do,
Yeah.
and I just needed to plug Drizzle into my mental model. I still couldn't do it because I let AI do the thinking for me, right? So I
Yeah.
realized that like it's like really it like shortcuts like the production process, but it really does hamper your learning. Like I've felt it hamper my learning
Yeah.
very tangibly before, you know. So
Yeah.
if you're trying to learn something new, I would like strongly like discourage you from like auto completing your way through like learning, like doing a
Oh
project.
yeah. 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 Conversely, so like when I was working at open source, I was leading front end over there, and I was aware of Tailwind, but I'd never actually used Tailwind in production. Like we had when I was doing front end at Dev 2, we had like bespoke CSS and Sass and stuff, and then but like I was very familiar with just CSS in general, and then I don't use ChatGPT that much now. I'm more in Claude these days, but when I started at open source, I was like, okay, I got to wrap up on Tailwind. And so like I would, there's some common ones that are pretty easy to do like Flex or Grid, and like they get pretty familiar really quickly.
Yeah,
But there was some more specific stuff I was trying to do, and the way I was learning Tailwind was this is how I would write it in CSS. How do I do this in
yeah,
Tailwind? And I found that like supercharged me,
yeah, yeah,
and this gets back to what I was saying about like the junior versus senior mental model, where it's like I know
yeah,
exactly what I
yeah,
want. I just don't know the syntax for it. So
yeah,
I found it super
yeah.
helpful for stuff like that. Um, Even starting to learn some Go.
Hmm.
I put some things in place because like my old coworker John McBride at Open Source, he's been writing Go for years. He maintains like Cobra CLI, which is like if you're writing a Go CLI, it's basically with that project. And I had to work on some Go at Open Source, and you know I was cranking out some stuff. I was asking Claude, and then he's like, "This is good, but the tests always need to run in parallel. That's valid Go code, but it's old Go code. Only
Hmm.
use
Hmm.
version 1.225 and higher." And so I added these things to my project settings in Claude to say like, whenever I write a test or ask for a test, it always has to be in parallel. Go has to be version X and above. And these things just added little guardrails to
Hmm.
just give me better answers. I still had to validate things obviously,
Yeah.
but I don't know. That's kind of ways I'm leveraging
Hmm.
whether it's Claude or I think you can do that in ChatGPT too. But Cursor has their rules as well
Yeah.
that you can add to a project, but yeah, but again, to your what you were saying too, yeah, if you're really trying to learn something, you still kind of have to go through that my brain hurts kind of,
Yeah.
and it's tough because like you can hear the siren calling from AI saying just I'll give it to
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like I felt it. Yeah, like again, I felt that man, I could look up the docs for Drizzle, or I could just ask an AI,
Yeah,
right? Um, and one of those is gonna make my brain grow, and
yeah,
one of them is not, right? So yeah, it is it's a tough trade-off. I think especially if you're just like trying to get something done, but if the
yeah,
point is to like get something done and learn something, I think it's like pretty clear what your choice should be, like in terms of like how you should spend most of your time in
yeah,
development.
exactly. Uh, that said, like there's definitely like in terms of AI tooling, whether it's GitHub Copilot or Cursor, like when you're in the editor, I find for definitely mundane boilerplate stuff, it's great. You know, it's like, okay, yes, you're pretty aware I've got an array here. I'm gonna map over it in React to create a list or something, you know.
Yep.
Obviously I can type that myself, but it's nice
Yep.
just those things are good, I think, too. And it's like, but there is a balance for sure. And yeah, I really am curious, like learning paths for people going
Mhm.
forward, you know, because like I don't know, not that the world's gonna shut down, but I could picture like an apocalyptic event happening where all of a sudden all these people don't have AI, and it's like I don't know how to cook this, or I don't know how to turn on a stove, or I I don't know how to do this.
Yeah. I mean, it's like at this point, I use it so much for even just like general questions. Like I ask it parenting questions all the time, you know?
Yeah.
Like I think it's much better at like answering those things than having to like dig through Google.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Google's like terrible now. Google like I just think it's like so bad at
I
finding
can't remember the last
answers
time I
to stuff.
used Google. I mean,
Yeah.
I ask it for very specific stuff, like where it's like, okay, where's this? What's this restaurant? I need the website or
Yes,
I need
exactly.
directions.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
anything knowledge based that like
Yeah.
for work, I rarely use it. It's
Yeah. It's such a chore to deal with, like,
yeah,
all the SEO spam and all that.
yeah,
But
that's true.
I do think that, like, it's, like, extremely powerful and, like, teach teach me I'm trying to learn Go, right? Here's what I
Yeah,
know, right? Like, here's what I know. Can you create, like, a personalized learning plan? That's, like, amazing, right? Like, that's, like if you use it that way, I can't imagine that's, like, a bad thing, right?
yeah,
Obviously, it's gonna hallucinate stuff, but if it's, like, really well-known topic, then I think you're gonna get, like, mostly quality answers from it.
yeah. No, for sure. And Tony in the chat saying, oh yeah, he says, I ask AI when I want some humor in my life for the crazy answers. But yeah, cool, cool. Yeah, I'm definitely happy talking about all this stuff still, but I'm kind of curious, and we can come back to what we were talking about too. But like, I guess like I'm an individual contributor right now. I've been a lead a few times, but I've also been a lead slash manager, which I did not enjoy because it was like literally doing both things, and I don't think that's
Mhm.
the right way to do it. And I don't know if that's why I'm not really that interested in management at this point. You know, like I am further in my career, but like, and it's not like I don't like people or anything. Like I'm totally fine chatting with people and stuff. It's just I'm still enjoying the engineering aspect of things, and so I'm kind of curious for yourself. So like, you were an individual contributor, and then you kind of started going on the engineering leadership track. And curious why you decided that, or just kind of what happened there. It's not a good or bad thing. Just generally curious.
Yeah. Um, I still wonder sometimes too, Nick. I think like to your point about like liking people, it's like yeah, I think I'm one of the more personable software engineers I've met in my life,
Yeah.
and I think it's a really important job. You know, I think there's a lot of people who think that their manager is useless. Um, and I think I've had a lot of good managers in my career.
Okay.
I've gotten pretty lucky with a lot of my managers. I think some of them are pretty useless. Like everyone has useless managers, but I think and some of them
Yeah.
are pretty useless in my experience. But for the most part, I've seen really good examples. Right.
Hmm.
I think it starts with like um, in my opinion, I think it's really important that your manager's technical, right? That they can understand my work, right?
Yeah.
That they know how like what's hard and what's not. I've had some of my worst managers, in my opinion, like didn't respect what I did. Like they
Okay.
knew it was like something they knew it was like something like important for the business, but like they didn't respect what I did, right? One of my
Yeah.
managers, like I was like doing starting my pivot into front end
Okay.
and at one of these companies and like basically what happened was like one of their architects had like learned a front end framework. It was Backbone at the time, Backbone and
Okay. Yeah.
Marinate,
Yeah.
and they had learned Backbone. They had written their whole front end in Backbone, um, and then so I was like tasked with taking it over, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. This is pretty
Mhm.
cool. I didn't know that like front end could have a framework, right? I thought it was just
Yeah,
like
yeah.
you just make the boxes move, right? Um, but it was like my first exposure to like a structured front end framework, and then like I
Yeah.
found out like halfway through my time of like taking on ownership of this code base that like my manager didn't think JavaScript was like a real language.
Okay, yeah.
And so that like is really annoying. That kind of stuff is really annoying, right?
Yeah.
And like at the time, I understand where she's coming from at the time, but like there was this, it was starting to happen, right? And I think she was like completely wrong, right? Like I think it was like
Yeah, yeah.
obviously, like in retrospect, I hope she thinks that, hope she looks back at that statement as like a pretty dumb thing to say, right? Um, like it's like basically taken over the entire dev ecosystem,
Yeah, yeah.
or the
No, totally.
development ecosystem. Um, so yeah, I've had those kinds of managers. I've had, but like most of them have been really good, and they've been really like they have encouraged me to like pursue what I wanted to pursue, and like they fostered my growth. They supported me
Mhm.
in my promotions, and I felt like they cared for me as a person. And I like saw firsthand that like, oh, that makes a really big impact on someone,
Yeah.
right? Like that made a really big impact on me, right? And like, could I be that person, right?
Mhm.
And so I that's why I was interested in. Like it wasn't.
Okay.
I and Airbnb and a lot of these big tech companies, which I think are doing it right,
Okay.
is they going to management is a lateral move. You don't get
Yeah.
it's not a promotion into management, and it still like blows my mind that like I see like tweets where like, oh, I found out like this girl I saw a tweet, like viral tweet, was like, on day one I found out I was going to be a manager, and I was like instead of an individual contributor.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, "Oh, make sure you negotiate a raise." I'm like, "No."
Yeah.
First of all, like the company is like probably really toxic that they like bait and switched you into becoming a manager. Second of
Yeah.
all, like it's not a better job, right? It's like
Mhm.
it's just a different job with different responsibilities, and like I need people to understand that, right? Like it's like really important for people to
Yeah.
understand that. That way, like you only move into management if you want to be a manager, right? There's so many bad managers went into management because they
Mhm.
thought it was a promotion, right?
Yeah.
And um I think that's like really toxic, you know? That has like that's like ruining people's lives, like their
Yeah.
professional lives, you know. The people who do that, and the people who report to them, right? Like
Yeah.
those people are not going to be good managers, under any circumstances. So
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, the TLDR is like I did it because I wanted to, right? Like I think
Okay.
like I wanted to try it. I think it's like I like the idea of like kind of being responsible, like shepherding someone to the next stage of the career. And I
Yeah.
still think it's like one of the most important responsibilities, especially now because like corporations are such like a faceless entity. Like by the way, I think we're entering the anti-capitalist portion of this of this conversation. I think like
Sponsored by
if you let me talk long enough, I'm gonna talk about capitalism. Um, anyway, yeah, so I think corporations don't do a good job of this, right? And so like I think it falls to people, unfortunately, right, to kind of like do that within this system that we're all in. So
Yeah.
yeah, I believe strongly in that, and that's ultimately the reason why I did it.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah. It's interesting what you're saying about how like it can be toxic if people assume it's like it's a higher up thing. You know, uh, I understand where that comes from because if you think this is more like old school thinking though, I think because like even when I started off it sounded like, oh, when you become a manager, which means you're just higher up. And also it's a cultural thing too, and this is I'm not saying this like for everybody, but like what I noticed was I was in India for work. We were basically uh, we were doing contract work for this company, and then basically they outsourced it all to India. So my job was to go down there, show them how to do a production deploy, how to configure some stuff, which I was happy to do. And it was just it's just very funny because like I was the expert on one of the things about this project, and we had all these video calls and just to like do knowledge transfer, and the person wouldn't talk to me until like he said, let me speak to your team lead or to your manager, like not you. And so like eventually, like I personally didn't care, but I was just like, I told my lead, I said, hey, can you just tell him I'm the expert on this, and just so I can teach him
Yeah.
how to do it. And so that was, I found that funny. But when I got to India, it was really interesting because like at the time I was like in my 30s, and they're like, "What? You're in your 30s and you're still a developer? Like you failed." Like
Uh,
like like that's literally what they said. And like, but and I didn't take offense to it. I'm like, yeah, I'm not really worried about it, but like there was definitely a cultural difference in terms of how this was perceived. And so like I just found that interesting. It's just more like an anecdote, I guess. But so I can kind of see where these things kind of come from. But I totally agree with you that it's a lateral move because it is a different set of skills. Like uh, his last name's escaped me, but Ryan from Netflix, Burgess,
yeah, purchase.
he's talked about this before, and like even I had two awesome managers at Netlify, and they were both very technical prior to that, and
Hmm.
they basically explained it was a lateral move too, and it is different. And I guess one question I have for you is, do you feel like, because I've heard this before, but people will say like, "Oh, I feel like I'm losing my technical skills." Does that matter to you? Does it bother you? Like, I know you're very technical, like you know what you're talking about, but I guess not being in the. I think people say this because of the fear of like, what if I decide to go back to being an individual contributor? Am I like no longer good? I don't know if that's where it comes from or what, but
I think I have never managed like a huge team before, right? Like, and I think even
okay,
with my CTO stuff, it's like, what the best way to become a CTO is? Found a company, right? And call yourself a CTO, right? That's like the best way to
yeah,
do it. And so my team is small, like I think
yeah,
like if I were to go to a big tech company, they'd like look at my CTO title and be like, oh, this guy was a frontline manager, like an M1 or like an M0, right?
yeah,
Like a very, kind of low level manager, just because like I've never managed like a team of managers, right? Um, I have also seen there's a lot of advice out there for managers of like stop coding, right? Like if
yeah,
you that's like one of the things you should definitely do as like a first frontline manager is like stop writing code.
yeah,
Um, and I don't agree. Like I don't think I agree. Like, and I think that like I for me. uh, I have very different ambitions than a lot of managers, I feel. Like,
okay,
I don't care about how many people I manage, right? And a lot of big tech companies look at that as like signal of
yeah,
like that's how good you are. If like 80 people roll into this person, they must be having like massive impact, right?
yeah,
Um I don't give a shit about that. Like I think like the thing that I find satisfaction in is like being responsible for like this group of people that like
yeah,
that I like, ideally, if my company had grown and like I had got like been in a place where my team would scale to like 75 or like 100 people, I would have been like happy about that. But I
yeah.
didn't try to like force that.
Okay, okay, I
Um,
gotcha.
and so, and one of the reasons why like it like aligns well for me because I can kind of like stay close to the code, right? And so I don't think I ever
Mhm.
spent like less than like 30% of my time writing code.
Okay.
At least at the CTO job. In big tech, I think it's different because in big tech, it's like you do a lot of like there's a lot of overhead in big tech, right? Like in
Yeah.
like managing at a big tech company versus like managing in a startup is very different.
Okay.
Because at a big tech company, like there's just like tons of admin work. Like there's like planning, there's budgeting, there's
Mhm.
performance reviews, there's like helping like figure out the performance, there's like training, there's
Yeah.
there's calibration to make sure that like your performance reviews are fair, right? It's like just like there's the process at the process, and like a lot of times you're like the project management for your
Okay,
team
yeah.
as well, because you didn't hire like a project manager, so there's like a lot of stuff, extra stuff in big tech versus like at a startup. It's like, oh, I'm just responsible for these people. I need to make sure they're doing a good job. I can do that in however way I want. I don't need to follow like the company prescribed guidelines for doing that. And a lot of times I'm making the company prescribed that, guidelines. And I'm like, I
Yeah,
don't want to do a lot of stuff, right? So I just want to make sure that like I just want to, like make sure that they know what the mission is. And like I need to broadly know that we're shipping, right?
yeah,
And so the overhead is much less, um, but I'm still like I get to do more of what I want to do, which is like mentoring them, guiding them, making sure
okay.
that they're taking on opportunities that are really valuable for them. So just like it's very different between the two different environments.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and it's like I've worked at a large org, but not large tech necessarily. Well, I worked at Autodesk, which I guess, I mean, they're an engineering firm slash they do a lot of technical stuff, but it's not like a Google or a Netflix. I mean, they do a lot of there's a lot of big stuff going on there, but I don't feel like it's the same thing like a Google or a
Yeah,
Netflix.
yeah.
But yeah, I do. One thing I found about the larger org is it just seemed to have so many redundant managers.
Yeah.
Like like it was literally like peeling an onion. I had my manager who reported to his manager, which was part of another org, which is like literally like 6 or 7 levels. And I'm like, again, this is just probably an artifact of a large company, but I also still wonder, like, did you really need all those levels? I don't think you do, but like there could be something from the business aspect that I'm not aware of, maybe, but it just seems redundant on the
I think it's
surface
a
at least.
it is a numbers game where it's like I think it's really hard to have more than like 8 people reporting to you, right? And like to honestly like care about them um to the degree that you should, right? Again, like I had my Yahoo manager who had 51 direct reports, and like did like I honestly wonder if he knew how to like spell my name, right? Um but yeah, like so I think like if you do have a large org, right, then and if you do break it down into like teams of 8, then you do need to
Yeah,
have like a lot of managers. So I understand that. Like I also I think there's like a flattening going on in the industry as well, where they're kind of like getting rid of layers of middle management as well. Um
yeah,
I think it's like TBD what kind of impact that will have. I think there's a lot of like I said, there's a lot of useless managers that should probably not be managing, but I
yeah.
don't necessarily think it's like net. I don't think it's necessarily a ratio problem.
Okay.
So yeah, I definitely think that like um a good manager can provide value. Just
Yeah,
I saw some chat about like mentorship. I
yeah.
think don't get into management if you just like mentoring people. Like,
Okay.
you kinda have to like the overhead, right? Like, sorry, like, at a big tech company. If you're
Yeah.
at a big tech company, I honestly don't think you're gonna necessarily. I don't even know if you're like, I think you could probably do more mentorship as a tech lead than as a manager,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and just for people who don't know what a tech lead is, like, basically, like, the most technical person on a team. Basically, they make a lot of like technical decisions for the team, kind of single point of contact for those technical decisions. That's often a different person from the manager.
Yeah.
Um, and I think you can make a lot of like mentorship impact as a tech lead. Um,
Totally.
yeah, like I think there's oftentimes a case where you're not even doing any mentorship as a manager.
Yeah, and it's I guess I'm curious too about like how you like I I've been lucky enough, and I feel like you've probably been lucky in most cases to work with people you actually like hanging out with.
Hmm.
Um which is awesome. But there's that fine line. People always say like your company's not your family, which I totally get that. But I my old managers from Netlify, for example, are good friends of mine now. But when you're in the work environment, I guess, how do you find that balance where like you're like buddy buddy, but also it's like you still got to be like the disciplinary person to a certain degree. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely think, this is one of the things I wanted to talk about is like I think management is lonely. Like it's like a very lonely experience. You cannot you cannot vent, right? Like you can't like vent to your team about like how things are going. Like I think like you can
Yeah.
maybe like in a very controlled way of like, kind of like exposing your vulnerability a little. I think it's helpful, but if you
Yeah.
do it all the time, you will destroy your team, right? Um and you'll like just you'll destroy their faith in the company and all that. So and like this is hard because I love to vent about things. Like I love to
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I like to complain and fix things, right? Like I like to complain and fix things, but I like to complain while I'm doing it, in like like a lighthearted way. I like try to like keep it lighthearted, so I like acknowledge people's feelings about things, and
Yeah.
um, it just being a manager really limits your ability to do that. So I think yeah, it's just really hard for you to tell people about like the problems you're dealing with, right?
Yeah.
Um, like, or if you're unhappy about like the direction of the company, you can't really say that.
Yeah.
Um, it'll undermine everything that your team is doing and like do opposite of like your job. um,
Yeah, totally.
so in terms of like, I don't think it's mutually exclusive to kind of like be friendly with people and like be to kind of give them feedback. I don't know. The work relationship is weird, right? Like
Yeah.
you can be great friends with people, and then like they leave the company or they get fired, and you like never talk to them again. There's no other relationship like that, right? Like where you
Yeah,
talk
yeah.
to someone every day, and then like this thing outside of either of your control happens, and you never talk again. That's like weird,
Yeah.
right? But it
Yeah, that
happens
is
all the
super
time,
weird.
Um, so, but like, yeah, I think like in order to operate within that, like I do care deeply about every single person that I talk to, and I also think that like I like to hire people for whom like that like discipline or feedback is kindness, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think there are people who like can't handle any kind of criticism, right? Or like I would have a really hard time working with those people.
Yeah.
I like to hire people with like a growth mindset who kind of come in ready to receive like critical feedback about everything that they do. Like Ryan was saying earlier in the chat that like he expects me to be really honest,
Yeah.
and I think that's really important. Like I want people who want that honesty, right? And so I think it's like a really important part of like the hiring process, right? If I've
Mhm.
hired someone who can't take that feedback, I have failed as a manager, right?
Yeah.
And so like and I think, even to the point of firing them, even to the point of like parting ways with them, like when I part ways with someone, I'm not like, you suck and you will never amount to anything, right?
Yeah. "You'll never work
It's
in this town again."
it's more like this job wasn't a good fit.
Yeah.
And the thing about tech is there are so many different environments that you can find yourself in, right? Like
Mhm.
every company needs software engineers right now, right? Um, and so like my company is like a very small company that's like pretty tech oriented, right? And that
Mhm.
has like layers and layers of like GraphQL and like all these other tools that you have to learn. And also it's a startup where it will die every 2 years they have to raise money or we'll die, right?
Yeah.
And you have to show a certain amount of growth or else we'll die. And it's a very specific kind of person who would thrive in that environment, right?
Yeah.
Versus like you can go work at like Bank of America or like Liberty Mutual Insurance, right? Where I imagine the pace of like learning is like much slower, right? Like where they're very risk averse, right? And like
Yeah.
the goal is to maintain what they have rather than like doing something innovative and like changing trying to change the landscape of whatever industry they're in, right? It's like a
Yeah.
very different feel, and the kind of person that thrives in that environment is very, very different from the kind of person who would thrive at my company, right?
Yeah.
So, um, like, I think it's like really, it does someone a huge disservice to keep them at your company if you know that like they'd be a better fit for like some other company where like the pace doesn't move as quickly, or like
Yeah.
the communication style is different, or like the industry is different. There's like so many different reasons why a role might not be a good fit, and I think it's
Mhm.
really important for people to understand that, right? Like if you do end up parting ways, so it like
Yeah.
I really I try to frame like all my feedback is like this is not about you as a person, right? It's like just about like
Mhm.
your the work that you're putting out, the fit for the role. Like it's not about who you are, you know. And I think it's
Yeah.
like it's really hard in this capitalist hellscape to separate those
Yeah,
two things, right?
for sure.
Because it's like in America, it's like how you get insurance for your family, right? It's like and that sucks.
Yeah.
But and I wish it were less. I wish it were less about that. But but as much as I tried in my words to communicate that it's not about that, that's what I do.
Yeah, and it's still tough even if you give this feedback or you let people go and it's just not a fit, you know, people still do take it personally even if they try not
Yeah,
to. It's cuz
yeah,
at the end of the day you are being rejected. Like
yes,
that's what it is. So it's never a great feeling, but obviously the way you deliver it like and this
yeah,
is just feedback in general like I was like I was alluding to before, like just having like an old coworker who I was used to the way they behave, but he'd be like, "Yeah, just fucking do this and do that," and I'm like, I just knew how they operated like that, and I was like okay with it, but like you know, giving feedback is a really tough thing to do, and it's something like I know I think I've gotten pretty decent at it, like in the context of like a code review, but I'm still working on it, and it's never
Mhm,
perfect, and it's like it's to your point where you're saying like separating the person from what's being done, like that's kind of what you have to do. It's like it's one thing to say like Mike, you did this wrong. Please fix this. Versus we're using Go 1.225.
yeah,
Test should be using this method instead of that one. Like
yeah,
same kind of feedback, but like I didn't
yep,
even mention you. And like that's where and because it's the lazy route is just to say just fix it. It's broken. That
yep.
doesn't work well. And it's tough and like obviously it's just it really is a skill, honestly. Like,
I totally agree. Yeah, like, and just to be clear, I wasn't being like, "Oh yeah, I'm just gonna start this firing conversation by saying, hey, no offense, but you're fired." Right? It's like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's like not like, of course, yes, like it's like impossible to separate the person
yeah, yeah,
from the work, right? Like in some sense, but like as much as possible that I try to do that, you know.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, for sure.
like, and I, it sounds like we had very similar mentorship experiences back in the day, right? Like old, like already old school people. Um,
Yeah.
for me, yeah, like I learned really early on to try and separate my worth from my work, right?
Hmm.
And because like it was my first job,
Yeah.
and it like, of course, I had to admit that I was bad at programming, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm bad. Like when you're at your first job, guess what? You're probably gonna be bad at programming, right? Like that's like it's like you have to be bad to get good, right? Everyone goes through that that period, right?
Totally.
And so yeah,
Yeah.
I learned really early on that like if someone's calling my work bad, it's probably because it's bad, right? Um, but still, yeah, like I think it's important. Like, not everyone is good at that or like receives feedback in the same way. Everyone's like wired differently, right? And so, yeah,
Yeah.
as much as possible, yeah, like you have to like try to make it as neutral as possible. Say we
Yeah.
instead of you, like all those kinds of things. Like I think
Yeah.
it is like a really important skill. And like I think the big one, like I think like people criticize this framework a lot. But the
Hmm.
SBI framework, I think, is really good. Like the situation, behavior, and impact, right? Instead of saying like, "Oh, you're late all the time," right? Um, say like, "Hey, I noticed you were late to a couple meetings this week," right?
Hmm.
It's like very concrete. Like you were late to the stand-ups like twice this week. I think it's a little bit disruptive to the team. That like it's like what happened and like exactly what they did and
Hmm.
exactly how it impacts the team, rather than like I can't depend on you because you're always late, right? Like those two things
Yeah.
are going to land really differently, even though it's about the same behavior. So I think just like being as objective as possible is really important. And I like again, like that's
Yeah.
like one piece of advice among like many about like how to give feedback well. But I think like
Yeah.
many people just don't do it, right? Like I think like a lot of managers, like if someone was late a bunch of times, even though it's like impacting the manager's perception of them, they won't say anything, right? And
Hmm.
they'll just silently ding this person on their performance review, right?
Yeah.
And that's worse, right? That's like worse than saying something and like potentially offending someone, you know?
Oh yeah, for sure. And that's kind of like the lazy route too. Like
Yeah,
and I guess this kind of ties back to like what are your motivations to be a manager, and like you're saying like you want to help people. You want you like you know you want your team to succeed, right? You know, it's not like
yeah,
it's not like because like I'm thinking the old school mentality is like, oh, it's my boss, oh, my boss is grinding my gears or whatever, you know.
yeah,
And
yep,
that's really not what it should be like, you know. And there's tons of depictions of this, you know,
yeah,
leadership versus a boss, you know, like guiding you versus like
yeah,
you know,
yep,
that guy on the chariot whipping people or whatever, or
yep,
I don't know this.
yep,
So it's yeah, it's yeah, things have definitely changed, and I guess I guess curious, like going from like engineering manager to CTO, like obviously you said like you're at a smaller company, so the shift to that, like it is still different though, like, or are you managing because it's a small company, are you still kind of more like an engineering manager, but just calling a lot of more shots in terms of like the direction technically?
yeah. That's basically it. Yeah, like a
Okay.
frontline manager that's like making a lot of like architecture decisions about like by a lot I mean all. Like at
Okay.
the beginning it was just me and a couple other like two other engineers. And I would say like the main difference was that even it was even lonelier, right?
Okay.
Because at the time it was like, you know, when I was engineering manager, I had a lot of the decisions made for me about the technical stack and all that, right?
Yeah.
Um, this one, I like built everything from scratch, like the internal tool, like deciding which internal tool framework to use if I should use any of them. I ended up
Hmm.
building my own thing. Um, Setting up the GitHub Actions CI/CD pipeline, setting up unit
Yeah.
testing, setting up our testing paradigm, right? Like deciding what infrastructure to use in GCP, right?
Okay.
Every single decision. And like I at the time, ChatGPT wasn't like smart, and so
Yeah.
I wasn't able to like talk to it about like all the different decisions I was making. And I was just like, hope this is good, right? Like I hope this won't like destroy the company later, right? And so I think it was even lonelier, you know, like just like
Okay.
I didn't know, I didn't have like a community of like CTOs like talk to at the
Yeah.
time. I've since integrated with like a couple other like leadership communities. But even then it's like I haven't found one where I'm like meeting with the same group of people consistently and like
Yeah.
checking in with each other about their problems, like a mastermind type of deal, right? There's
Yeah,
just
for
not
sure.
that many of them out there, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is like kind of like facing like when you face problems on like a software engineering team, most of
Mhm.
the time you can find someone
Yeah.
very easily on Slack to talk to about it, right? And yeah, like when you know the most about your technical stack at your company, it makes it much harder.
Yeah. No, for sure, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and like you said, it's definitely super easy or relatively easy as a developer to get that help, whether it's internal Slack,
Yep.
communities, like even social media, like I
Yep.
put out stuff before, not necessarily asking for help, but like I remember putting something out and just saying, "Oh, I'm stuck on this thing. Here's my PR." It was I was just kind of just putting it out there. I wasn't really asking for help per se, and then like the person that worked on that project, it happened to be an issue with Preact, which Jason
Yeah.
Miller, the creator, well, we're mutuals on socials now, but like he at the time he went into my PR and added a comment, try this or that, you know, like which not a lot of jobs outside of tech do that
Hmm.
kind of stuff too.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
Yep.
I feel like, you know, tech Twitter, socials, whatever, I feel like it's pretty tight knit.
Hmm.
You know, people you've never met, they'll be like, "Hey, try this, man," or you know, and it's like
Yeah.
I can't really envision like, you know, I don't know, like a urologist just popping on Twitter saying, "Hey, like this guy's got this thing. Anybody got any ideas?" You know, like it's not something they would do. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And
Yep.
also maybe illegal too because you're
Yeah.
providing personal information, maybe. But yeah, I just think it's kind of unique to our industry a bit. I think
Yep.
so. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of people creating content for individual contributors.
Yeah.
I think there's like there are some people creating content for like managers, but I also think the context of management is like maybe this is a bit naive for me to say, but I think the context of the management environment that you find yourself in is probably more important um than the context of the engineering you find yourself in, right? Like
Okay.
if you're like working on React, then like almost anyone in the world working on React can help you with your React problem, right? If you're struggling
Yeah.
with like a management problem, right? Like it's a lot harder for people to kind of give you advice, right, about how to deal with your situation. I think they can try, right? Like I think a lot of it is like just interpersonal and like relationships and just general like relationship advice. But I think a
Yeah.
lot of it is also like how do I navigate my company, right? Like and how do I navigate the how do I establish like a performance review process for my company, right? That
Yeah.
that like I think is going to really be company dependent,
Mhm.
so yeah, I think it's like it's harder to get advice, as a manager.
Yeah, for sure, and it's like, yeah, and you're gonna make mistakes. I think people are always afraid of mistakes, like traditionally, like, oh, I messed up, or and I again, I think this is just like old school going to new school, but I feel like typically these days there's less finger pointing, and it's like, okay, this went down, or we screwed up, how can we do this better the next time, and I find it pretty incredible, especially like for tech companies, even when like there's big downtime on things, you'll always see like hug ops and stuff,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
and nobody's really mad at them. They're just like, or like if
Yeah.
GitHub goes down, somebody will post the unicorn picture of the,
Mhm.
and it's like, but it's generally not a negative thing. Obviously, like it can still affect, the bottom line for companies, but like it's just interesting how, and it's probably not every company, but I feel like there's less finger pointing, like, Nick screwed up, man. Way to go, man. It's really more. It kind of gets back to the feedback and like management of like separating the person from what went down. I think it's kind of a similar thing, and it's like, they're agile. They'll do retrospectives and stuff, but there'll be incident reports and stuff, and I just find it's interesting that it's kind of more of a positive thing to some degree these
Mhm.
days. I don't know what your thoughts are there.
I mean, I think it was called like a blameless postmortem at Google. Like that's where I learned
Yeah.
about the concept of a blameless postmortem is at
Okay.
Google. And um I think it's like the best thing that like I think tech has brought several good things into the world in terms of the world of working. I think it's like obviously there's some
Yeah.
toxic things that big tech has brought into the world as well.
Yeah.
But I think the blameless postmortem and a parallel track where you can be an IC forever. I think those are like the
Yeah.
two best things that the tech industry has like innovated on in as far as like people's working world, right? The
Hmm.
blameless postmortem, right? Like I think it's like the concept is if someone like there's a viral Reddit post a long time ago
Okay.
where this intern the first day on the job was trying to follow the onboarding instructions and they got access to their prod database and dropped it, right?
Okay.
and and they got fired, right? And I think a lot of people have like accurately pointed out that it is whoever like there are a lot of people to blame for that, not the
Hmm.
intern. Like
Yeah.
that is not the intern's fault, right? For
Yeah.
following the instructions on a sheet and somehow gaining access, like an intern gaining access to the production database,
Yeah. That's a
already like a
major
huge
failure.
red flag, right? And the prod database things being in the onboarding instructions, like strike two, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
that CTO should have been fired, right? That's like some just really egregious stuff that
Yeah.
leadership should be responsible for, right? Um, and so I think there's this like belief that like, oh, you don't blame the human who's sitting in the chair because like if you substitute them for any other human, then they could have made that mistake too, right? The point of like technology is to make it like as difficult as possible to make a mistake in the first place, right? And
Yeah.
it's like about building really robust systems for preventing people from making mistakes. How do you make the wrong thing very difficult or impossible and make the right thing easy, right? Like that's like our jobs, right?
Yeah.
And I love that. I love that about the industry. Like that's like one of the things I love the most.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tony in the chat's like, the intern has access to production drop WTF, which is
Yes.
totally valid. Like, um, yeah. And then this is just a question from Abimanu saying, Mike, what piece of advice would you give to a MERN stack engineer from India? Do you think that they should learn LLMs and AI next? I'm a little confused. Wish I could connect with you. Okay, I don't. There's a bit to unpack there. I don't know if like we can really go deep into that right now, but I guess general advice. What would you say, Mike?
Um, I would keep doing what you're doing until like I think there's this like barrier with what LLMs can do, and I think that like my it's very difficult. Like I just want to quantify that like I can't predict the future. People
Yeah.
like back in 2012, Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, was like, we're gonna have self-driving cars in the next 5 years,
Yeah.
and like it's happening now. Like Waymo is a Google self-driving car unit. They just launched in Miami, I think.
Okay.
They're in 3 cities now. But like I think Sergey Brin was saying like no one's going to be driving cars in 5 years, right? 2017.
Yeah.
That was 7 years ago, right? Um, and he said this 12 years ago. And I think with a lot of AI, there's this like 90% is like that the reason why I made this prediction was because they made tons of strides in terms of self-driving cars. But like to get like a fully autonomous self-driving car, it's
Hmm.
taken a really long time for them to try to get to that point.
Yeah.
And I think they're still in the process of doing that, right? I feel the same about LLMs, right? Like I feel the same. Like there's already a lot of research papers saying like they're starting to hit a wall in terms of like how productive they can be, right?
Yeah.
I think that there's people trying to get around that with these like AI agents and stuff like that. So I think that there's potential for them to kind of break through that wall using like a different workflow.
Yeah.
TBD whether they can do that or not, right? I know that in my experience using Cursor, it's very good, but it suggests the dumbest shit sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And I it will have to fix what it's doing, and like I can keep trying to prompt it. Like I find that like one thing I've noticed when I use an LLM is like when I start arguing with the LLM, it's over. Like just
Yeah.
cut,
Yeah.
cut, like end that task, do it manually, and then move on to the next thing, right? Like I'm trying to like I'll be like, oh no, on line 21, you did this, you should be doing that. Like
Yeah.
end
Yeah.
that chat, right? Like you're gonna save a lot of time by ending that chat.
Yeah.
So it gets stuck like that, sometimes, right? So I still think there's a lot of value to um just being a really good engineer. I think there's no value to being a surface level engineer now. Like knowing syntax, like which is like a lot of what bootcamp does. Like bootcamp, like
Hmm.
in my opinion, bootcamp teaches you like syntax. Like they teach you like a language.
Yeah.
That's worthless. That's like worthless stuff. An LLM knows how to write JavaScript, right? It's like that's a
Yeah.
solved problem, right? But like knowing how to solve problems, right? Like taking like knowing how to like talk to your account manager on your team, their salesperson, right? They have an
Hmm.
ask from a customer. Knowing how to like talk to your designer and like turn that into a feature, and like your product manager, turn it into a real, feature spec, build it, iron out all the edge cases, right? Like that's still going to be really valuable for a long time. And so, yeah, like I would say like, yeah, maybe it's a possibility that like it's a better career option to like pivot into AI research, right? But I still think that there's room for software engineers to provide a lot of value.
Yeah. No, for sure. And it's kind of funny. So I just want to say, hey, Fuzzy in the chat. Fuzzy always, I got to put you on the Nightbot allow list because it's blocking you for some stuff, Fuzzy. But anyways, yeah, to your point about like arguing with the LLM, there's that, and I've also found where like when I look at something, I know it's wrong. I'll say like, can you do this? And then all of a sudden it suggests it as its idea as opposed to what
Oh
I
yeah,
and
I'm
I'm
like,
like, oh,
I'm
thank you
like,
for stealing my idea.
yeah. It's like the classic. Oh, this is what it feels like to be a woman in tech, right? Like
Yeah,
where
yeah,
where a man will say the same idea and then pretend it's his idea.
yeah, it's rough, but yeah, it is interesting to see where stuff with AI goes. Like, I know like Swick Sean Wang has talked about this a lot, and not just him, but like I definitely see like you were talking about AI agents. I think like ChatGPT or Claude, it's people kind of treat it like an all-knowing oracle, and that's good for some things, but like this is like because I've been writing some GitHub Copilot extensions and just messing around with that, and so like you can basically have an agent. It's just specialized. Like this is the debugging agent, or this is like
Mhm.
or at like this is a CI/CD pipeline agent, and it knows everything about I don't know GitHub Actions. You know what I mean? Like and and it's kind of like you're building your own little army of workers to help you with specific tasks, and it's really good at that specific thing, and
Mhm.
I feel like that's how things will like kind of play out to some degree.
Yeah.
It's like because otherwise like like ChatGPT or Claude or whatever you're using, Gemini, it's just too broad, you know what I mean? And it's like
Mhm.
it could still find you the answer, but it's going through a sea of stuff versus where, if you have something completely trained on just GitHub action docs and clear examples of specific things, like
Yeah.
I think that's where you're going to get better bang for your buck.
Yeah.
But these things take time to build out too. But like I think those are you're just going to start seeing a proliferation. I mean, I'm pretty sure that's why GitHub Copilot chat went this whole extension route, like
Yeah.
it makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, so just curious to see where it goes and like, and even like local ones, like I have, like I was just messing around with a GitHub extension to use Olama. So like I have Olama running on my computer. I'm gonna put it on a Raspberry Pi, and I'm gonna try and make it publicly available, like secure, so I can actually just use it wherever.
Mhm.
And like there's that whole aspect too, like you know the language models that are in the cloud that might have your data versus like you're running this locally, it's going nowhere, like I don't know.
Yeah.
And on device stuff, it makes a lot of sense. It's just like I don't know, there's just so many moving parts right now. It's like wild west a bit.
Yeah, I mean, like, that was, like, one of the first things I said when I started talking about this is, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know what's gonna happen, right? Um, like, I think, I do spend a lot of time, um, like, when I'm trying to do something I've never done before, that's when I spend a lot of time talking to AI about it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I'm like, I'm still adding value to this conversation. I wonder if there
Yeah.
will come a time when I don't anymore, right? Like when I'm not adding value anymore, right? Like I'm still like able to like, clarify the requirements really well and stuff like that. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I also think that like, one of the things that we haven't talked about is like asking good questions is really important. I think it's
Oh
like
yeah.
asking good questions has always been important, but it is a difference between you being able to use AI and not, right? Like
Yeah.
if you ask it really terrible questions, like if you ask your coworker really terrible questions, like they will correct you, right? They will
Hmm.
say, "Hey, I don't understand what you're saying." And AI
Yeah.
will not, right? And so if you have not learned how to ask good questions, then you cannot benefit from AI, and that is going to be a major disadvantage to you. You know?
Yeah, no, for
So like
sure.
asking really clearly what you are looking for, like not open-ended at all, like making sure that like this person has all the context for like the situation you're dealing with that led to this question, right?
Hmm.
Those are all going to be really important skills, kind of going into this next phase of learning.
Yeah, for sure. My old coworker Becca, kind of, I think she's the one that said it, but other people have said it too. But like just like English or is the language of
Hmm.
AI. At least obviously it supports other languages, but I would say right now it's predominantly English. But it's like, and this gets back to like how I leverage these tools too is like from the rubber ducking standpoint of view. It also helps me communicate better. You know what I mean? I could say like make me make me a metrics dashboard, and it's going to go, okay, here you go. And then I'm going to be like, no, that's not what I want.
Yeah,
I need
exactly.
a metrics dashboard that shows me the logs from this blah blah blah. Like it's about being more just basically what you were saying. But like, and I find it could be a good tool to kind of learn to communicate. It's literally like a virtual
Yeah.
rubber ducky now
Yeah.
to me. Um,
Yeah, I think like also if you know that you're bad at asking questions, AI can help you ask better questions. Be
yeah,
like, hey, here's the situation I'm dealing with. Like, I don't know what question to ask. It can
yeah,
help you do that, right? Like, so I think like again, but you need to know to do that. Otherwise,
yeah,
it's just gonna try
exactly.
to answer whatever crappy question you come up with.
Yeah, yeah. And this, yeah, I guess this kind of comes full circle to like the whole experience versus just starting out and leveraging these tools, you know? So it's like, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. It is rough right now. Like, even like I'm starting a new role next week, and I'll be honest, like it was nice actually having a couple months off for
Mhm.
sure. I've actually really enjoyed it, but in my experience, and I'm definitely not alone in this, is like it's my network, people that reached out to me or that I spoke to are where things actually happened. Like anything I kind of cold applied to without any
Mhm.
kind of connection whatsoever, whether it's like a even just DMing somebody, like those were kind of crickets, and it gets back to what you were saying too. Like there, like it's an amazing time to be in tech right now, but it's a lot more difficult if you're starting off right now for sure, like you said. But even some more senior people are struggling to find roles too. And like
Yep.
you were saying, there is a huge pool of people out there now. And like, you know, I'm definitely very fortunate and still fortunate to be able to work remotely. You've been working remotely. There's it you know if you want to get those jobs, like you kind of have to go a bit above and
Yeah.
beyond to make it happen. And it's kind of gets back to what I was saying about putting in the work and also like just standing out. And I know there's introverted people obviously, but like I don't know, you got to do stuff to stand out. You almost have to. It's maybe a sad state of affairs, but you kind of have to be not just a dev, you have to be your marketing manager, you have to be your social
Yep.
media person. It's like literally everything these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth thinking about like um what like yeah, if you're a new engineer, it's
Yeah.
worth thinking about like what if you can't code better than an LLM, which I think if you're just starting out, maybe you can't.
Yeah.
You have to think about like what else you can bring to the table, and I think passion is one of those things, right? Like
Mhm.
if I like I need to believe that you can code better than an LLM in 6 months, right?
Mhm.
In order to hire you,
Yeah.
so and I think like one way to communicate that is like, yeah, I'm gonna put in the work to learn things really deeply, right?
Yeah.
Um, I need and like it's really helpful to like show that you've done that already, you know, um, which again is not something that you and I had to deal with. Like, we just need to just show up and be like,
Yeah.
I know HTML. I know HTML. Most people don't, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And if you want HTML written, you have to hire me, right? And that is not a choice that's not a problem that employers are having right now.
Yeah, exactly. And this is somewhat related, but Tony in the chat's asking, is Motivo Health still hiring for that senior engineering role? Asking for a friend.
They are. They're in the middle of the hiring process. Feel free to send me your information though. You can
Cool.
find. Yeah, I think Nick has dropped my socials
Yeah, I just
into the
dropped it again there. You can
uh
find it all there, Tony.
I'm most active out of all those things on Blue Sky. But I'm not even that active on Blue Sky anymore. I'm gonna get more. I'm gonna get more active. You're gonna see. You're gonna see this year.
Cool, cool.
But yeah,
Y-
feel free to DM me, Tony.
Yeah. And I know we're almost at time here. I'm happy to keep chatting a bit longer if you want to, but I'm kind of curious. You're moving on from Motivo, or are you just taking some time off and figuring out what you want to do? Just kind of, obviously, you have the luxury to chill a bit, I think.
Mhm. I am still figuring it out. I think
Okay.
like I quit Twitter back in 2022.
Yeah.
And but like I was pretty involved in the dev community at the time, and Blue Sky's taken off, and I'm
Mhm.
like curious if I'm gonna invest more time there. I would like to. I find social media a little bit draining, but I like the idea of like finding a community. The
Mhm.
thing I like most about that idea is like getting excited about technology again, right?
Yeah.
I think like you're gonna meet a lot of seniors who are not that excited about technology, right? Like they're just like I remember this feeling. I was at Wealthfront. This was back in 2016. I remember I was like building a dashboard, and I remember this feeling very distinctly of like, is this it? Is this all there is to like to like web development? It's just like building my 90th dashboard. Like like putting pulling data from the back end, putting this card here, right? Like that's the rest of my life, right? But like you kind of like go on these like tech communities and like people are like making art with technology, right?
Mhm.
And like in my opinion, like that's like more fun to me than making money with technology. Like making money with technology is like, in my opinion, it gets old. It gets old, right? Like, I don't know if everyone else feels that way, but like I've talked to people who do, but like I don't know if everyone feels that way, but it does get old. And I know I'm spoiled. I'm being very entitled and privileged and spoiled by saying that, but um, but like it's very different creating something for yourself. Like I'm working on my own like
Mhm.
a bit working on like a personal like Rolodex, right? Like
Okay.
app that it's just for me, and I get to like spend as much time like on this like little animation, right? Like I get to tweak the animation thing. If I did that at my company, we'd be fucked. Like like if I spent like all my time
Yeah,
like
yeah.
tweaking little animations instead of like thinking about like how to boost our revenue,
Yeah.
we're dead, right? Like I like, and I think you also get that luxury if you work at like a huge company, like Google. Like it doesn't matter what any of their engineers do, they're gonna make
Yeah.
money, right? Like it doesn't matter how much time they spend like making delightful experiences, right? Like they're gonna make money, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like yeah, if you work at like a pre profit startup, you have to be just ruthless about like how you prioritize your time, right? So I
Mhm.
think like that is at odds with like enjoying the craft, right, of engineering, you know? So, um, I am really hoping to jumpstart that excitement again,
Mhm.
by just, like, building things for fun, you know?
That's cool, man.
There's this guy named Neil.fun. He just, like he releases, like, hit after hit. If you go to, Neil.fun,
Okay,
he
I'll
like,
go
I this is
find
one of
that.
my favorite sites where, I dropped it in the YouTube chat, but,
Okay, cool.
just like he makes stuff for fun, and that's really cool. I love that, you know. Um, just like doing tech for money, doing tech for fun is like just two completely different experiences. So yeah, I want to see if I can remember what it was like when I was like first building stuff and like really like honest to God enjoying it, you know.
Yeah, and like you said, you are privileged to be able to do that, but you put in the time to get to where you are. So like I don't think you're like looking down on people by saying that. This is just like this is what you're further on in your career than a lot of people as well. So like, and you put in the time. So like, I think it's great that you can kind of rediscover that and curious to see what you end up doing. I know I'm trying to find it, but Lee Robinson from Vercel was writing about he's just enjoying creating some projects right now. Like there was a whole thread about like, because everybody's always got to build a SaaS, got to build a
Mhm.
SaaS. And
Yeah.
uh, I'll find it somewhere, but I can't remember if he posted it on Blue Sky or Twitter, or X. But yeah, he was kind of saying a similar thing, like,
Hmm.
and it's true. Like, and I'm kind of gonna be doing that a bit too. Like, I got this here. It's a Cana kit. It's like
Mm.
a
Yep.
Raspberry Pi,
Yep.
and I've honestly never built a Raspberry Pi. I did some work on one for a friend at some point, some software, but um, like it's a side project, but it kind of ties into my GitHub Copilot extension I was talking about. It's like I'm gonna put Olama on there on
Hmm.
in a container, but I'm also gonna put Pi-hole and use that as my DNS so
Hmm.
I can filter out like just stuff partially for my kids, but also just general stuff I don't need showing up like ad blocking and stuff. So I don't know. That's kind of like something I'll probably stream about it because like I've never built it. I mean, I'm sure it's not complicated, but it's just something to tinker with, you know? And like,
I I have a pie hole. It
okay.
is that's a weird thing to
Yeah,
say.
yeah, no, I know it's
Um,
that's weird.
I I think companies have gotten really good at circumventing the pie hole, unfortunately. The
Okay,
one thing that it is really good at is I stream Peacock on my Apple TV,
okay.
the streaming service, and I never get ads on Peacock. But
Oh, okay,
but
okay.
like YouTube has figured out a way around it, Amazon's figured out a way around it, Apple TV's
Okay,
figured out.
okay.
It's just yeah, like it's the golden age of pie hole is unfortunately over, but I still encourage you to do it. I think like it
Yeah.
blocks like like ad trackers and stuff like that really well. So, yeah, and like I've been really enjoying tinkering with the pie as well. And especially for my kid, like I want to kind of like get into like robotics and stuff like that.
Okay, yeah.
And so I think that's like, yeah, I think these types of things are really fun. I also Canna Kit is also the starter kit that I got as well. So
Okay, cool.
I'm
That's good
excited
to
for
know
it.
that I picked a good starter kit.
Yep.
Um, yeah, and yeah, I guess that's a good place to wrap it up. So super excited to see what you get up to in terms of some fun time. And yeah, Abimanyu saying thanks for bringing on Mike today. Loved your energy, enthusiasm. So, and I thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you, and folks in the chat definitely enjoyed the conversation from what I saw in the chatter. Um, so cool, cool, cool. I'll drop links where people can find you one more time there, and um, this is already up on YouTube, but I'll post like the links for where people can find you on there after. And yeah, thanks again for hanging, everybody in the chat. Thanks for all the questions and the comments today, and we'll see you in the next one. I'm starting, like I said, my new role on Monday. So I'm gonna figure out what my streaming schedule is because I just obviously have to adjust to my new role potentially. So I don't have any other people scheduled at the moment, only because of that. But I'll get that sorted out pretty quickly. And yeah, take care, everybody, and we'll see you in the next one. And Mike, if you don't mind just hanging on for 1 sec, and
That's good.
take care, everybody.